Hey everybody, thanks for coming. Great to see so many of you here. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Sort of? Okay, I'll speak up as much as I can. I'm Jonathan Lethem, and just so you know who you were introduced to, this is Isa, this is Pamela, Laura, and Erik Davis at the end. I'm going to speak just a little bit informally and probably ramblingly about my own connection to this project and a bit about the context for it.
Turn the mic on.
Turning the mic on.
It should.
There you go. Better? Hey there. So let me just talk a little bit about how I got involved in this and what I think it is. I mean, describing this book is something you could kind of spend all day doing. But Philip K. Dick, as probably many of you know, was one of the great underground science fiction writers of the 20th century until a little bit later when he was recognized, I think, and increasingly is accepted as simply one of the greatest American novelists of the 20th century, albeit one who worked his entire life in from a kind of marginal position. And he's his first real fame came within the science fiction community when he won the Hugo Award, the biggest award that community has, for his 1962 novel, The Man on the High Castle. And then, there's too many great titles to name, but if you jump 20 years from that point to the year, unfortunately, that he also died, Blade Runner, a very famous and seminal and influential science fiction film, was made by Ridley Scott from one of his great novels of the later 60s, Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep. And in some ways, that moment helped spearhead very slowly the increased interest that led to his canonization and his books all being back in print and also very widely studied. He's both a kind of an author who's received a real popular embrace by readers and has become very canonical in academia and cultural studies in an incredibly gratifying way in the years since his death. Dick was a big influence on me. When I was a teenager, I read all his novels and decided I wanted to write just like him. And I also had the idea that I would come out to California and meet him, but I didn't manage to do that before he died. But I did come out here and do what seemed to me at the time the next best thing, which was introduce myself to a man named Paul Williams, who was at that time helping Laura and Isa by kind of maintaining the estate such as it was. It was a strange estate in that the author's books were all out of print and had no apparent commercial prospects, although there was a strong kind of cult interest in them, and there were already some very interesting inquiries from filmmakers, including, of course, Blade Runner coming along. But what happened for me was that I got involved in a kind of really interesting tiny subculture of fans who were helping kind of keep the flame lit by publishing something called the Philip K. Dick Society newsletter. I think the subscriber base hovered around 800 people internationally for the years that the newsletter was being put together. And I actually did some of my very first writing in small critical pieces that were published in that newsletter. And in that time, when even the very prospect of his books coming back into print seemed kind of a marvelous fantasy, and it wasn't necessarily likely, word had kind of gone out in a small way that there was a very large trove of unpublished writings, and that these writings were of an esoteric philosophical nature. They weren't fiction, and that Dick himself had called them his exegesis, which made it sound in some ways like a very consummated or finished or complete thing. But in fact, if you learned about this trove of writings, the information was all fascinating. It was actually somewhere between 8,000 and 9,000 pages, mostly handwritten, although there's a percentage of them that are typewritten, mostly unrevised, completely unrevised. A few sections might have been worked over a bit. Written over the course of the last 8 years of Dick's life as a result of a series of, revelatory experiences he felt he'd had, clues, incomplete insights into the nature of existence and the universe, and that had compelled him urgently to commit his thoughts to paper and to try to sort out what he'd experienced, the glimmers of insight he'd experienced. And these became his exegesis. They also were notions that had become familiar to fans of Dick's because he alludes to them in his last three, and then it turned out a fourth novel, a kind of unpublished novel that came to light after his death. So there are intimations of this material in the last three books published during his lifetime, which were sometimes called the Valis trilogy and have generally been grouped together. The first of them is called Valis, and then there's the Divine Invasion and the Transmigration of Timothy Archer. But of course, all these books only give tiny, tiny inklings of what that kind of writing might have been like. His preoccupations in those years are indicated, but what the exegesis itself consisted of remained quite mysterious to people, and those who had heard of it became very provoked and very, very intrigued. But it was also regarded in a lot of ways as a kind of what would you call it? Sort of the bridge too far, an unpublishable, incomprehensible mass of leavings that would never be described or archived or let alone published within our lifetimes. Well, here we are. Strangely enough, we find that we've managed to do something with it. And there were many stops along the journey. Paul Williams himself, made very initial forays with the help of a scholar named Jake Kinney. They transcribed a few snatches of it here and there. And then Dick's biographer, Lawrence Sutton, made deeper forays and ended up publishing a volume in, somebody help me, maybe 92, that was a kind of a less than 300 pages of excerpts, highly distilled excerpts from it, the bits and pieces he thought would be most accessible to people. So that gave a little window into it. And then, well, I'm going to have to cut this story short so that other people can speak here, but we sort of cut to my friendship with Pamela. She's writing here at Cal in the rhetoric department, writing a dissertation about the last phase of Dick's writing life, which I guess depended very heavily on Sutton's volume of excerpts, and it was an inquiry into what she could have, what she could see of the exegesis. And I'd sort of gone back to New York and lost touch with the estate, but then many years later was it reintroduced, or introduced for the first time to Laura and Isa, and among the topics that came up was this idea that maybe somehow actually the exegesis was something that should be approached. And we just visualized ways this might happen. And truthfully, if you'd said at that time that it was going to happen as quickly as it did, or that it would happen from a major New York publisher, I think we would have kind of laughed. I was envisioning, even as I was representing, I think, the optimistic wing, I was thinking that it would be a scholarly edition, or maybe a small press, maybe perhaps even just an imprint dedicated to this one project that would sort of arise as a nonprofit or a kind of a crowdsourced project in order to get the thing available to some people who would care to see it. But anyway, the conversation was intermittent, and then when Pamela agreed to spearhead the project, it suddenly took on some life. She'd gone on, very fortunately, from her dissertation work to become a trained archival librarian. So she sort of had a unique double qualification as a scholar of the exegesis and someone who was trained in dealing with archival materials to make this, what was really a very brave foray into this 9,000-page disaster area, and come out with something more or less like a book, enough of one that we could propose it to Houghton, Mifflin, Harcourt, and have them say yes. And then suddenly, of course, there was this
and have funding
deadline.
Have fun. It was fabulous.
Well, we'll carry the story forward from there. There's lots about the process of editing it and bringing it to point where you can hold it in your hands that's terrifically worth describing, but I'm going to let some other people speak. Laura, do you want to kind of talk a little bit from the estate's perspective next?
Sure.